so funny.
All right. So I think at the top of the hour here, at 7 o'clock, we're going to start our workshop portion of our meeting, for which, no rush. Natalie was going to walk us through some of the requirements of the HDLO, somewhat of a refresher.
Yeah.
And then the other item, well, we want to kind of open, depending on how much time we have, we kind of want to open just to the group the conversation around, other potential workshop topics, things we might want to discuss amongst ourselves as part of workshop, or otherwise hear from our attorney or planners or engineer.
Yeah,
So,
I think we decided next month we'll do seeker again, just
Yeah,
to refresh
good idea.
everybody. But then we have the whole rest of the year to fill with fun training opportunities. So yeah, today we're going to talk about historic preservation regulations within the City of Beacon's code. There's an overlay and then the underlying zoning, so this is a little bit unique, so we'll spend some time going through it, both for the board and for the public to understand what the board's looking at when we say a property is in the HDLO or is designated. So Chapter 134 is the City of Beacon's Historic Preservation Code, and we'll kind of walk through that. Just so everyone knows, all municipalities in New York State most municipalities in New York State have their code available online. If you type in E-code and the city or the municipality you're looking for, the full code should come up online. So just for folks who may be following along at home. Chapter 134, which is outside of the typical zoning code for the City of Beacon. So the purpose of this chapter, as you would expect, is to encourage the preservation of properties that are of special historical or architectural significance in the City of Beacon specifically. So the HDLO is what we say, and that stands for Historic District and Landmark Overlay Zone. As an overlay, I think the unique aspect here is that these regulations are in addition to the underlying zoning designation. So that's when you see that projects will come before you, they will say, I am in the CMS and the HDLO, or I am in the R15 and the HDLO, because you layer on top. It's not one or the other. The HDLO is additional regulations on top of the underlying zoning. There's a process first. Let's talk about how we get something to be designated. So a designation in the City of Beacon can be initiated by the City Council, the Planning Board, the property owner themselves, or a preservation committee. Yes.
This is a designation on the parcel, not necessarily the building. Or is it?
It can be.
Could it be either?
It could be either. Yeah, depending on the nature of the site. But it's to get anything designated within the HDLO, any of these bodies can bring forth that application.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep. And then within this, the subsection 4, there's a bunch of regulations about what has to happen in terms of process that I'm not going to focus on too much there, but just so you know, like if the council is bringing something forward, there's a process of notifying the property owner. A public hearing is always held for a designation nomination, and then the deciding body, the City Council, has to decide within 60 days of that public hearing. So just there's always like a notification process in case the property owner is not the one bringing forward the application to be designated. And then to designate a property, there's usually one of 3 criteria that a property, a building, or a site will fall within. It either has distinguishing architectural characteristics that represent a certain period, style, or method of construction. It can be a more simple structure that is just associated with a cultural, political, or social, historical moment, or person, or organization. Or it can be listed on as eligible for inclusion on the state or national registers. So there's 3 levels of historic designation. There's national, state, and then local level. And we're talking specifically about the local level today. So like we said, it's an overlay on the zoning map, so you can find the city's zoning map on the city's website, and the parcels identified in red, as the key is very small here, but what the key says is all these parcels that are identified in this red hatch are HDLO properties that have been designated either within a district or as an individual parcel. And then so the certificate of appropriateness is required for all exterior alterations, construction, or demolition that affect a historic feature of one of these sites, right, that are in the HDLO. No building permit can be issued until a certificate of appropriateness is approved by the planning board. So the building department is the first one to kind of usually catch these if there's modifications to a historic structure. Typically, a building permit is filed, and then the building department, marks that as requiring approval by the planning board or a COA from the planning board. Maintenance is typically exempt. There's a whole section 134-6 that kind of talks about different types of maintenance that are exempt from review. So, not all work on a historic structure requires review, but it's if you are changing something of the appearance. And then that goes a little bit deeper. So alteration, construction, or demolition, alteration is specifically defined in the code, and here's that language I was talking about. It's a change, right? Visible from a public street, public sidewalk, or public park. So usually typically interior work, there is some kind of, at state level, and I don't know if it's necessarily in the local, if you're doing interior work and it's a publicly accessible space, that will sometimes be subject to a COA as well. But it's typically exterior work that is visible to the public. And then here's kind of the list. It excludes typical maintenance, repair, or replacements, excludes plumbing and electrical work or minor accessory utility work that don't substantially detract from the historic nature of the property. So now you have to jump in. So 134-5 in this chapter then kicks you back to the typical zoning code. So you have to kind of jump around in our code. So you have to jump back to the zoning code to 223-24.7. That is where the code lists uses that are permitted by special permit within the HDLO. So again, because this is an overlay, there's uses that are permitted in whatever the underlying zoning is, and then this list here is additional uses that are specifically allowed on HDLO properties in order to allow for the active use and rehabilitation of those sites. And those are broken up into two categories. There's specialized businesses that are associated with history, arts, or culture. So this is not an all-inclusive list, but artist studios, antique shops, rare book, coin, or stamp shops, or similar kind of historical or cultural uses. There's a second category of uses that are permitted by special permit, and these are categorized as residential, hotel, or professional uses. And each one of these kind of comes with a cap or a stipulation associated with it, right? So restaurants up to 50 seats, bed and breakfast establishments up to 10 rooms, professional offices up to 10 employees, multifamily up to 4 units. So everything's kind of capped to keep these more, I'd say, commercial uses kind of limited. And then hotels and hotel-related accessory uses with adequate screening. There is also a section in 223-24.7 that does allow for some deviation from these these kind of caps on this second grouping. And the planning board, this is at the discretion of the planning board, and the planning board must look at the building size, the building's configuration, the nature of the proposed preservation or adaptive reuse of the building, or the historic nature and context of the building and the need for preservation, adaptive reuse. So there is kind of a release valve if maybe somebody is proposing a larger restaurant or a greater number of multifamily. If the site and the building kind of demand that larger, or not demand, but facilitate that larger use, there is ability for the planning board to approve that. And then for these special permits, when the planning board is looking at special permit uses on an HDLO site, they must look at the following findings before granting that. And I've kind of broken them up. They're listed as only 4, but I broke them up so we could go through them a little bit easier. So exterior restoration maintains architectural and historic integrity. New construction is compatible with neighboring structures. The proposed use is compatible with the neighborhood. Activities can be adequately buffered from surrounding homes, specifically residential homes. Resulting traffic generation will not overburden existing roads. Adequate parking can be provided without unduly destroying kind of the landscape and setting. A lot of our historic sites have kind of larger open spaces or landscape spaces surrounding them. So you want parking to be provided, but without kind of diminishing that natural setting of the historic site. And then the planning board must also look to see that the proposed use is appropriate to the structure, will aid in the preservation of the structure, will not result in undue alterations or enlargement of the structure. And so again, these standards in the HLO are in addition to, there's typical special permit standards that you're always looking at for a special permit use, which I think we went over in February, and I'm sure we'll go over again at some point, as well as the HDLO standards in chapter 134. So now you kind of leave the zoning code again and you go back to chapter 134. So then there are an additional level of kind of criteria or things to look at if you are looking at properties that require site plan approval. So anything over kind of one family or two family, things that require site plan approval or a special permit, or things that are specifically in the CMS, the Main Street District. And when looking at those, there's an additional section of criteria, which is 134-7, that look at the kind of appropriateness of the development to the property, the scale and height, and then architectural kind of elements of the building and the site. So we don't have to go through all of these, I don't think, in detail, but I think something worth noting is what we've been asking from applicants in front of the planning board lately is that they go through each one of these and you hear from the designer, from the project team who is creating the development plan, to kind of go through these and talk about how they feel their project responds to these criteria that you're looking at. Would it be helpful to go through each one of these, or? Yeah? Okay,
Yeah,
all right.
especially since we do have a couple of applicants,
Yeah.
applications within the HDLO.
It's good
We
just-
want to make sure that we're.
Yeah, so first category A, so there's A, B, and C, so we'll go through each one of these. So A is looking at the design, character, and appropriateness of the property, and to the property of the proposed alterations or new construction. Construction shall build on the historic context, with applications required to demonstrate aspects of inspiration from similarities to adjacent HDLO structures or historic buildings in the surrounding area. So we should see images and photos kind of within these presentations saying this is what we've tried to mimic with this roof style or this window style if we're seeing new construction. Compatibility does not imply historic reproduction, but new architecture shall also not arbitrarily impose contrasting materials, scales, colors, or design features. So the intent is to reinforce and extend traditional patterns of the HLO district, but new structures may still be distinguishable in up-to-date technologies and details most evident in window construction interiors. And this is really aligned with the State Department of Interiors that looks at state historic districts, and there's been a recent, not so recent, but over the last few decades, a shift in historic preservation of moving away from replication more to compatibility, right? So it's actually, you'll often see comments from SHPO, from the state, asking for new construction to be distinguishable from the historic architecture so that you're not mimicking or arbitrarily kind of expanding the historic building. They want the historic aspect to be very visible and the new construction not to be identical, but to be compatible, right? Finally, number 4 is exterior accessory elements such as signs, lighting fixtures, and landscaping shall emphasize continuity with adjacent properties in the HDLO and the historic characteristics of the sidewalk and streetscape. And where possible, parking shall be placed towards the rear of the property in an unobtrusive location with adequate screening from public views unless another location provides better screening. Section B is looking at the scale and height of the proposed alteration or new construction in relation to the property itself and surrounding properties of the neighborhood. So where possible, an addition to an historic structure should be placed towards the rear or at least recessed so that the historic structure remains more prominent than the subsidiary addition. Any alteration or addition to a historic structure shall not damage or obscure character-defining features of the architecture or site to the maximum extent possible. The height of any new building facades in the HDLO shall not conflict with the heights of adjacent historic structures on adjoining HDLO parcels. And larger buildings or additions should incorporate significant breaks in facades and roof lines, generally at intervals no more than 35 feet. So this is something similar that we see in the language of the linkage district and the CMS district about kind of breaking up facades. Yep.
I'm sorry, I'm just reading that number 4, so I can be absolutely clear. Larger buildings or additions should incorporate significant breaks in the facades and roof lines. Okay, got it.
Yeah, just kind of break up the massing, right? Yep.
That I'm familiar with that one.
Yep.
I was thinking setback.
And then the third section is looking at architectural and site elements and their relation to similar features of other properties in the HDLO, so going a little bit beyond the site. So it's not appropriate to disrupt the relationship between a historic building and its front yard or landscape, including screening historic properties from traditional street views by high walls or hedges, also obviously by buildings themselves, right? And this kind of goes back to the last section of buildings being set back or behind. Historic storefronts, porches, cornices, window and door surrounds, or similar architecture features should not be enclosed, obscured, or removed so that the character of the structure is substantially changed. Deteriorated building features should be repaired rather than being replaced, and if not repairable, should be replicated in design, material, and other historic qualities. New buildings in the HDLO shall have a top floor cornice feature or eave and first floor architectural articulation, such as an architecturally emphasized entrance doorway or porch to accent kind of the central body of the building. 5 is that architectural features and windows shall be continued on all sides that are clearly visible from the street or public parking area, avoiding any blank walls except in cases of existing walls or potential common property walls. And then new HDLO buildings shall have a front entrance door facing the primary street and connected to the sidewalk. Oh, sorry, this goes on to 10. This is the long section, yeah. Window proportions shall be greater in height than in width, but the planning board as the approving body may allow exceptions for storefront windows or transom windows. And then mirrored, reflected, or tinted glass is not permitted, and shutters shall match the size of the windows. Finished building material should be wood, brick, traditional cement-based stucco, stone, smooth cast stone. There's a whole list here. I think what's worth pointing out is vinyl, aluminum, or sheet metal siding or sheet trim, exposed concrete blocks or concrete walls, plywood and other similar prefabricated panels, or unpainted or unstained lumber, synthetic rough cut stone, synthetic brick, basically anything synthetic, EFIS or DAF, I've never heard this one, direct applied finish system, DAFs, and chain link plastic or vinyl fencing are not permitted. Materials and colors should complement the historic buildings on the block. Fluorescent, neon, metallic, and other intentionally garish, that's one of my favorite words, as well as stripes, dots, and other incompatible patterns shall be prohibited. And then finally, mechanical equipment and refuse containers shall be concealed from the public view. So these are things that we kind of do here in the regular code, but I think they're also, they're re-emphasized here in chapter 134. There is a release valve or an opportunity if an applicant applies for a certificate of appropriateness from the planning board and they are denied, or I think I don't know if they necessarily have to be denied, or they can just choose to go this option is there is a request for a hardship, and that would be handled by the ZBA, not the planning board, and in order to receive that hardship kind of granting, they must prove that they can get no reasonable return from any other use of the property or use of the property that would be approved by the board. There's no viable adaptive reuse other than what they're proposing, and that they've had failed attempts to sell the property to somebody else who might be able to do the work that would be approved by the reviewing body. So it's in all 3 of those, so it is pretty hard to achieve that or demonstrate that hardship. So that's it. That's chapter 134. And again, I think we talked about this a little bit, maybe it was during the last meeting, and you were probably picking up as we were going through this, is there's a lot of room for discretion within this code, right? There's shoulds and compatible, and like art, those things, you have to kind of go through those, each one of those, whether something is compatible is unique, I think, to the site, to the district it's in, to the surrounding properties. So it does require a lot of discussion, which often happens between the planning board and applicants when going through these criterias. It's not necessarily just a box you can check, like, yep, meets this.
Yeah, we love subjectivity here.
Yeah, yes, and discretion.
Yeah.
Great. So any questions on that? So just reminding folks, it's kind of two sections of the code. You have to look at 134 and 223-24.7 are the two sections there. Also, a good resource if you're looking at historic assets is CRIS. It's a state-run website, CRIS. Cultural Resource Inventory System, I believe is what that's for. And you can use that as a guest. And if you go in there and type in an address, you can see all different types of historic resources around that site. They try to track local, state, and national resources, and you can kind of even, for some of them, see the background information for those, like what the designating language was, or the designation form that was approved when they filed for their designation. So
Nice.
it's a good resource. That's it.
Thank you. Any,
Awesome, thank you.
any questions? Yeah, I think, again, given that we have a number of applications under HDLO, it's good for this refresher, so thanks. And, just as a reminder to the board, those are the criteria we want to make sure that we're putting these applications under in terms of our scrutiny and review. So, what time is it? We got 10 minutes. Or, actually, again, beacon time, we have 10 minutes. Regular time, we have 7. Clock is always off. So we thought we'd just do a little bit of a query of the group on subject matter for future workshops.
Yeah, and I think at the end of last meeting, we maybe started the conversation, and there was conversation about maybe wanting to have, looking at some specific areas of the code that the planning board may want to discuss, making recommendations to the council about updates to the code. So I think the transitional district came up specifically. I also had a note about parking lot design, but I don't know if that was me or somebody else said that. So I think things like that would be helpful too. We can kind of use these training sessions to review that section of code and then discuss potential updates and modifications that the board may want to pose to the council.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, next month we'll do SECRA. That usually
Yeah.
takes more than a half hour, but we can certainly fill the half hour.
Yeah.
I do remember someone mentioning linkages. Was that you, Kevin?
The district?
Yeah. Just
No,
curious. I do remember that, so.
Yeah. I did have one thought about
Yeah.
submission requirements for the plans. I noticed that this session, some of our plans have really informative location plans and site plans that show adjacent properties, right? And I think anybody that's looking at these, I think it'd be really useful for every plan, everything that gets submitted, to have like a location plan of where it is in the city, and then like a site plan of like the block and adjacent structures, because almost all these applications have a lot to do with the context that they're in, and it really helps us get our handle on the sort of issues that are going to come up, to be able to focus on it and understand it better. And it's not tough to do.
Yeah, I agree. I think if there's a way we can help the city council understand how we might want to revise language around requirements for submission, that's a really great topic. I can actually point specifically also to certificates of appropriateness and making sure that we have good, clear communication out to applicants on what we expect to see, what we sort of require. I think it's pretty loose at the moment. So we may want to work on that. So maybe it's just one, general topic of submission requirements that we drill down into.
Yep.
That's a good one. Thanks, Kevin. Good suggestion. Yeah, and again, I don't remember what context or linkages came up in, so I'm not really certain what we might want to focus on there. So we should give that some thought.
Sorry, I missed
honestly
that.
don't
Sorry.
remember what context linkages came up in, so I'm not exactly sure what we would want to focus on there.
I think, I thought the conversation was the transition, the
transition.
T district.
Ah, okay.
That's what I had in my notes, and I think it's because it is a really unique district, but there's not necessarily the design criteria that we see in some of the other districts, like the CMS or the linkage.
Yeah.
So potentially thinking what might be appropriate for that area.
Actually, I think under the larger rubric of design criteria, we may want to start with that conversation.
Yeah.
And understand which specific districts have requirements around design,
Yeah. Yeah.
specifics. I wouldn't say guidelines or, well, they are to some degree guidelines. And then maybe drill down into if there are districts that don't and should, or might want them, and then, start the conversation about what those specifics might start to look like for each of those districts. I mean, that's a bit of a job, I think, but it's certainly worth starting to frame the conversation. It's one of those things, and I remember from years past, in conversations with the city and the board, that we may want to recommend that the city sort of extract from our workshop and put together, with consultancy, a committee to look at, review, and drill down into.
Yeah.
So we maybe want to talk about that and what that recommendation to the council looks like, what the process there might be. Sound good?
It sounds like a positive, it's a good thing to put our efforts in, definitely.
What else? Any other juicy topics? Landscape, lighting?
Lighting, I think, would be a good one.
Yeah.
That's always a major topic.
Who wants to learn about stormwater management practices?
I do.
I do.
I want to know what SWIP stands for.
I would
Do the
love,
energy code, no.
I would love to see someone do a presentation on best practices on parking lot design and stormwater
There you
practices
go.
around parking lots, because I've seen some. I don't know whether they're like, something that's a good model, that seem really, that they solved a lot of problems, both with stormwater, not having the retention entrances like these depressed areas between the parking rows instead of raised curbs, right? That seem like infiltration areas and
Yeah, bioretention type
bioretention.
systems.
There's, and I've seen some of these things just in my wandering around that I thought, oh, that's a great idea. That's a great idea. And a lot of times we haven't done a ton of large lots here, thank goodness, because I hate large parking lots. They're not a positive thing in any city. But when that is something that needs to get built, I think either having some sort of an incentive to use these best practices as opposed to just doing the thing that's the cheapest,
And also-
would be a good thing.
And also understanding when they work and where they don't work, right?
When they
Because I
don't
know
work.
you're always telling me soils and things
Oh,
like
yeah,
that.
well, I know a lot of people are always pushing for infiltration. In the city, we have a lot of clay. You can't infiltrate water into clay.
Oh,
It just
understood.
doesn't work, you're gonna have a failing system.
Right.
A lot of these systems work great, but the other key aspect is maintenance.
Yeah.
People have to maintain these systems. If you don't, they eventually fail also.
That's most,
So I think that's a really good topic.
yeah.
So we'll give John something to do. Get your
Yes.
PowerPoint ready.
I told you it's
I
gonna
don't
be
even know how to use PowerPoint.
I'll make
about
your
to find out.
PowerPoint. You just tell me.
Good, yeah, and I think this is a good crowdsourcing. We have some good ideas. Yeah, and if you think of anything else, send an email around.
Is it possible to do like a, at some point, kind of like a walkthrough of exemplary projects in other communities around the country that maybe are facing similar kind of development, pressures, or just, sort of like a state of the state kind of?
Yeah. Well, exemplary. I would charge each planning board member to bring a project they think is exemplary, and then we can see who agree, because I think exemplary is
one.
in the, what? You've got one?
Wait,
Okay.
Design standards in Seaside, Florida.
Okay.
You know that one, right?
Yeah. I mean,
maybe could be considered a little too restrictive and development prohibitive, but
Yeah.
it's a good starting point.
okay. But, yeah, I mean, I would say, if that's what you're looking for, like, design, were you talking about specifically about design standards,
It
or?
could be design standards, or it could be,
Master planning.
yeah, or even just large projects that are considered particularly innovative and, you know, maybe, again, it's new development, but it's well adapted to an existing historic milieu, you know, stuff, just to see what other people are doing that is considered, you know, very effective.
I only say that I would charge each planning board member to bring that forward because it really is the eye of the beholder, right? So I do a lot of community engagement where we're showing visual preference boards, right? Where I'm showing different communities that have done different things, and I will get visceral reactions from different members of like, love that, hate that, that's the worst thing I've ever seen, that's the best thing I've ever seen. So it is, I would almost say it'd be helpful to share our examples of projects we think, and then I can dive deep on those, on the zoning regulations that may have formed those.
Good idea.
And the last thing is there anything specific, we talked a little bit before about going around zone by zone and focusing on standards, but infill housing in historic neighborhoods, I just feel like we could look at some of the different approaches to that.
Sure. Yeah. Look at that. We got the rest of the year and part of next year for that.
Awesome.
I think once you get into the various zones and start breaking it down, it's going to be
Yeah.
on its own.
Yeah, that's why I think it's one of those things that may be a sort of a standalone, right? I think if we start to sort of kind of, you know, developing an understanding and an overview, then it may give us, you know, I think good framework for, you know, helping to pull together some recommendations for how the city might approach that in committee.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because we all love committee work. All right.
I don't know how pertinent this would be. Everyone's background, I think, probably colors what they think might be pertinent. But would it be useful to have a session on judicial review? And basically, what are the frameworks that judicial review of board decisions fit into? What is a court going to be looking at if a decision is getting challenged? And, you know, kind of the flip side of that is what can we be doing to issue good decisions?
Yeah. I think that can come
That's
in,
one for
I think
these
that
guys.
comes a little bit into, Jen's done this presentation a few times of kind of like the purview of the board and the responsibility of the boards. And so I think it comes into that, because I think a lot of the lawsuits or legal challenges to planning board's decisions come down to process and documentation on the record. So I think we can, Jen, I think has touched on that before, and we can definitely touch on that in seeker, because I think a lot of that comes up sometimes with regards to seeker review. So next month when we're going through seeker in general. I'll talk to Jen and Christian about that. I think that would fall to you guys more than me.
Well, I'm going in a slightly different direction in there, because what I'm really talking about is like, you know, a little more nuts and not so much getting into the details of what should the secret process look like, for example, but a little more nuts and bolts along the lines of what does judicial review actually look like? I mean, a majority of the time that's going to be an Article 78 proceeding. It could also be a Section 1983 proceeding if someone's asserting a regulatory taking or due process claim.
And you're looking to see what they're going to be looking at in those cases to make their determination?
Yeah, like what the review standards are. I mean, this is something that's very familiar to me, because I actively litigate government claims, both for and against the government, just not in the context of the city of Pekin. But it's occurring to me that it's basically kind of a foreign language for most of the people here.
I think he just volunteered to do the work.
Oh, yeah.
I could easily do this.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I mean, the county hires me to defend these kinds of cases from time to time, so this is like directly up my wheelhouse.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, I think that, great idea.
I think it is a good idea.
You're just trying to get it.
Yeah, maybe collaborate with Jen a little bit. and-
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, just because too, a lot of times you're not necessarily the people who are coming here, attorneys who are coming here to represent the board are don't necessarily have a lot of experience doing litigation per se. I'm not saying that's an across-the-board thing. I don't really know what your background is, but...
Yeah, no, I do the litigation for the land use.
Okay.
So, usually on the other side though, challenging municipalities.
Great, so we
Yeah,
can
no,
do
I've
a mock
definitely
little,
done
Mock trial.
little mock trial going on. We'll really see.
You can't handle the truth. All right.
Okay.
We've got to move on. These are all great ideas.
Yeah, thank you, guys.
So,